the suspected timeline of when a National Guard deployment could occur in Chicago. A surge in ICE resources could be pushed to Chicago, where they'll operate out of Broadview. ABC7 was on the story. Not the I-Team, but ABC7 was on the story. They got to cancel a parade in Waukegan because they want to keep the community safe.
Our objective is not to frighten the community, but to let them know what's the real deal. What's the reality? They are here.
That looming immigration operation is why organizers of the Fiestas Patrias Parade and Festival in nearby Waukegan, which is the largest of its kind in the state, have now postponed the nearly 30-year-old event that was set for September 14th.
We do have 50,000 people that come out to our parades, and our number one priority is the safety of our residents, and we just had to make that call.
Number one priority is the safety of your residents. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the number one priority of ICE as well, interestingly. So you're in complete agreement. The approaches are a bit different, though, I got to say. For example, in terms of the safety of the community, now this isn't Waukegan, but the principle applies. A Venezuelan migrant is charged with first-degree murder, accused of stalking a group of boys through Canaryville and opening fire without provocation, killing a 15-year-old and wounding a 12-year-old in a chilling daylight ambush. I don't think listeners to this show need me to go through the incidents of crimes committed by people in this country illegally who are residing in Chicago. Just among Venezuelans, much less the general population. And again, I'll stipulate that it's a small percentage of those people who are here illegally, but a small percentage of a big number is a big problem. And it turned out to be a big problem for the 15-year-old that was killed by this Venezuelan, didn't it? That's real. Also real just in general, since we have the amalgam of domestic as well as imported violent crime here. The story of Kathleen Miles of Lake Villa. Kathleen Miles, Lake Villa, suburbanite, coming to experience big city living, and boy, did she. She sure did, because she ran into a repeat violent offender who likes to beat up women, and without much consequence. Here's the story of the individual who beat up Kathleen Miles on the streets of Chicago. Big city living. I don't know if we have that. All right. Well, anyway, here's what Kathleen Miles had to say about this guy.
Like, what is enough? What does someone have to do where they're going to be held accountable?
Yeah, and there she's talking about is an individual who has repeatedly beat up women. In August of 2023, arrested for knocking a woman in the face as she walked down the Mag Mile. Slammed his elbow into her face, leaving her bleeding from the nose and lips. He was arrested, but state decided not to hold him for a parole review. He's released ROR. Wasn't in prison for long. A record showed that he was released again on January of 2024, 4 months earlier than his original parole date. Last August, he was back at it. Frantic citizen flagged down officers near Chicago and Wells, was attacking people in the area, had just whipped a woman. As the citizen pointed him out, officers saw him punch another woman in the face. She ran off, and police never found her. They filed only a misdemeanor reckless conduct charge. His parole was revoked, and then he walked out the next day. 2 weeks later, 15-year-old girl walking with her mother in the 600 block of North Michigan when the same guy struck her on the right cheek with his elbow. The teen, 15-year-old girl, suffered a cut and abrasion on her face. And then officers quickly learned of the attack, arrested him. And he prosecuted again. And then back in 2022, he tugged a 30-year-old woman's backpack as she prepared to cross the street. And then she turned around. He punched her in the face, knocking her to the ground. Then he punched a 25-year-old woman in the jaw as she smoked near Wabash and Van Buren. Victim called 911, followed him to Wabash and Jackson, where she saw him reach into a 25-year-old woman's coat pocket, then punch her in the face 3 times. And so, I mean, it's just there's literally 8 cases in the last 3 years of this guy punching women in the face randomly and or to take their stuff on the streets of Chicago. Kathleen Miles being the latest. So if it's not a Venezuelan migrant opening fire in Canaryville, it's a repeat violent offender being, well, treated to opportunity after opportunity to prey on the residents or visitors to Chicago. So this is the sort of culture we're talking about when the discussion turns to additional resources and resources that come with a completely different attitude than the local civilian political leadership. For more on this, please be joined by John Malcolm, Vice President for the Institute for Constitutional Government and Director of the Meese Center and the Ed and Sherry Gilbertson Senior Legal Sherry Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good to be with you.
So you wrote a piece. You're a D.C. denizen. You wrote a piece for USA Today that we actually referenced the other day, saying that you welcomed the National Guard deployment to D.C. Now, I know the legalities are a little bit more complicated for cities not named D.C., but what has been the impact in D.C.? Because here's, just before I get to you, here's what J.B. Pritzker, our governor, told people in advance of any National Guard deployment or ICE surge this weekend.
Third, as lawful citizens exercise their First Amendment rights, Trump and his team will be looking for any excuse to put active duty military on our streets, supposedly to protect ICE. We have reason to believe that the Trump administration has already begun staging the Texas National Guard for deployment in Illinois. I want to be very clear on this point, and I want to speak directly to the press right now. We know before anything has happened here that the Trump plan is to use any excuse to deploy armed military personnel to Chicago. If someone flings a sandwich at an ICE agent, Trump will try and go on TV and declare an emergency in Chicago. I'm imploring everyone, if and when that happens, do not take the bait.
Is that what your experience is in D.C., John? Is that what you've seen National Guardsmen and ICE agents trying to bait people into giving them a reason to arrest them?
Yeah, I certainly haven't seen that. I work right around Union Station. There's a heavy National Guard presence there. There's no question that crime over the last slightly over 3 weeks, ever since this was put into effect, has dropped dramatically. There have been some shootings, but I'm not sure there have been any murders, and very, very few shootings at that. Lots and lots and lots of people arrested. Even the mayor, Muriel Bowser, who was the first objecting to this, has admitted that crime is down significantly and is now trying to find a way to work with the Trump administration to extend this deployment beyond the 30-day period called for by the Home Rule Act. And I think that will happen. And I think that ultimately the citizens, the residents of D.C., including myself, but particularly in places like Anacostia, where crime is 40% higher than the rest of the district, are going to end up being very grateful as gang members are arrested and illegal firearms being possessed by convicted felons are taken off of the streets. But we will see. But in the meantime, it's a lot safer being a resident of the district.
And have there been sort of the typical sort of AstroTurf bought and paid for protests that we're accustomed to when Trump does something, which is basically anything that the left abhors, like enforce the rule of law?
Well, it's hard to tell because in the district there are always those kinds
Yeah,
of
well, right,
protests
yes,
going on,
right.
including right outside the Heritage Foundation.
Right.
So it's hard to tell whether there's a marginal increase
Yeah.
or not. But certainly we saw what happened in Los Angeles when ICE agents were called out to do an immigration enforcement effort. They were attacked. Businesses and cars were torched, and the local police, proved themselves to be either unable or unwilling to assist. And that's obviously what Donald Trump is preparing for, is at least a possibility in Chicago. Governor Pritzker obviously has no interest in having law enforcement there. Illinois is a sanctuary state. Other governors like Jeff Landry in New Orleans are actually welcoming this sort of effort. So there are some articles that suggest that perhaps there will be a deployment in New Orleans before there's one in Chicago, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, and the change in attitude by the mayor there, Bowser. I mean, what's driving that? I want to take the rationale in the light most favorable to her and just say, well, she's seeing what's working, and she obviously wants to go along with what's working because she wants her city to be safer. But I feel Pollyannish in believing that about one of these big city mayors.
Well, it's hard to tell. So there's an article out in today's Washington Post that the president is working with the House and Senate to try to pass a crime reform bill that will have a dramatic impact on how crime is prosecuted and judges are appointed in the district. So I suppose maybe she's trying to head all of that off the pass by being more cooperative. I don't know. I can't crawl into Muriel Bowser's head, but there is no question that crime was extremely bad in D.C. The police are being investigated for trying to manipulate statistics. It seems as if that is certainly being borne out. And even people like the police union chief, Greg Pemberton, is saying, look, they've been doing things like taking carjackings and writing them down to car theft. They've been taking things like armed robbery and marking it down to assault to try to lower the violent crime statistics. And you can't argue with success. I mean, the crime rate has fallen dramatically in the last 20 plus days.
Yeah, this talking point is still being used, but it seems like it's being used less with respect to D.C. I think the D.C. press corps is trying to move on from D.C. as quickly as possible and focus on Chicago or New Orleans or Baltimore, wherever Trump may strike next, and see if that goes worse, so that they have something that they do want to talk about. Because the talking point that murders in America are down 20%, violent rates in D.C. 30-year low. I mean, only people like Arnie Duncan, who actually has an op-ed in the New York Times about this, are continuing to repeat those sorts of talking points because, residents living in D.C. today are not really interested in longitudinal studies about murder rates. They're interested in what's happening in their neighborhood right now.
Yeah, and let's be clear, crime is not at a 30-year low in the district. So is it a little better than it was in 2023, there were 274 murders in the district. Last year, it was down to 187. So is that an improvement over 2023? Yes, it is. But in my article, pointed out that between 2009 and 2019, there were only an average of 128 murders per year. So that's, roughly 59 murders higher last year than there were for the average over that decade. Same thing in 2023, there were 957 carjackings. Got better in 2024. There were only 497 carjackings. But in 2018, there were 148 carjackings. So crime got better in 2024 than it did in 2023, but it is still way higher than historical averages. You'd have to go back to the 1990s when there was crime all over the country in order to find the kinds of numbers that we've seen in the district and elsewhere in the last couple of years.
What's your view on Trump's open contemplation about the National Guard to U.S. cities like the ones mentioned, Chicago, Baltimore, New Orleans, elsewhere? The idea that per his constitutional limitations and the Posse Comitatus law, he would use them to enforce federal law. He'd use them to backstop the work of ICE in those cities, and that would be it. Number one, do you believe that's within his authority? And number two, do you believe that's a judicious use of the National Guard?
Well, I can't answer the second one because I don't know exactly where hot spots are where the National Guard might be called for. I can answer the first one. So a district court judge in California, Charles Breyer, former Justice Stephen Breyer's brother, just entered an order that said that the deployment of National Guard to support ICE mission in Los Angeles violated the Posse Comitatus Act. Judge Breyer, with all due respect, is a very, very liberal judge who's entered many, many orders against the Trump administration, almost all of which were overturned when they reached a higher appellate court. And I expect that'll be the case here. So the Posse Comitatus Act is real. It definitely places limitations on the president's ability to federalize law enforcement, federalize National Guard and military troops to enforce local law enforcement. But there's a clear exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, and that is when they are brought in to assist federal officials executing federal law, and local law enforcement officials prove themselves to be unwilling or unable to assist that effort. You had ICE agents in Los Angeles who were bricks were being thrown at them from overpasses, cars were being torched, businesses were being vandalized, and windows broken. I mean, there was mayhem in downtown Los Angeles, and either local police were being ordered or just decided not to help, or they were simply being overwhelmed. And I think that the calling in of the National Guard under those circumstances was completely warranted. And that's why you hear J.B. Pritzker sitting there and saying, they may come in here and do a nice enforcement action. Don't rise to the bait. Don't attack them. Don't give them an excuse to call in the National Guard in order to support those efforts. I don't know whether the citizens of Chicago will listen to that or not. Certainly the citizens of Los Angeles did not.
Yeah, well, in addition to that, you had Brandon Johnson, the mayor, issue an executive order saying that any federal law enforcement in Chicago will have to comply with City of Chicago policing rules and procedures. Well, of course, that's silly, but it just gives it. And in addition to us being a sanctuary city and a sanctuary state, so I mean, in terms of the exception to Posse Comitatus, it's already present there because the local political leadership has declared we will not cooperate, we will not participate in your enforcement of federal laws. Now, they would say, well, we're not going to interfere, but lack of participation, sort of the lack of assistance is arguably an impediment to enforcing federal law here.
Well, somebody should point out to the mayor that there's something in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause,
exactly.
And that federal law trumps local laws in that respect. And, it's true that under the anti-commandeering principle that state officials don't have to help federal officials in the execution of federal law. But these are still human beings who are being assaulted. And that is, you do require local law enforcement officials to enforce local laws like preventing federal officials from being attacked by Chicago residents. And if they are not doing that, then the president is well within his rights, in my opinion, to call in military personnel, specifically the National Guard, in order to protect ICE agents who are executing federal law.
The other thing that Pritzker has said is that their presence here will interfere with local law enforcement and local law enforcement carrying out their duties. Is that the experience in D.C., that the National Guard is preventing the D.C. police from carrying out their duties?
Well, here the D.C. police are cooperating, and not only that, but you're having some National Guard people, for instance, being deployed to keep order in low-crime areas, and that is freeing up metropolitan police officials to be able to go into high-crime areas where they are needed so that they can engage in effective law enforcement operations. Something tells me that Chicago also has hotspot areas where a more police deployment would be helpful, and getting some assistance in low crime areas from federal law enforcement officers or even the National Guard would be a helpful thing. But that's the kind of thing you would expect. The sky's going to fall if federal officials come in. You would expect to hear from people, officials who don't want the National Guard deployed.
John Malcolm is Vice President for the Institute for Constitutional Government, Director of the Meese Center, and the Ed and Sherry Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
And John Malcolm, join us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Virago is fending off viruses and making America healthy again.